It is now a joy to bring up our next storyteller, Terry DeMio. She's coming to us from the Cincinnati Enquirer, and Terry has a story about a project she worked on that changed an entire community. Take it away, Terry.
Thank you. I became immersed in the world of heroin in 2012 when I made my way back to the Cincinnati Enquirer as a general assignment reporter. And I noticed an inordinate number of people dying from heroin overdose. And at that time, there were no buildings to go into to find out more information about this disorder. So I went to grieving families, moms mostly. And I followed them as they begged for help from state and local governments, from health departments, even from medical doctors, most of whom were doing nothing to help them. But I wasn't new to heroin. I was very close to someone for most of my life who had, as an adult, acquired this heroin addiction disorder. As a child, she had a full, loving family. She was always an honor student from elementary through college. She was very talented and beautiful, but mostly she was a kind and wonderful person. But she became addicted to heroin. Now, after a time, she got help from methadone, which at that time was the only medication-assisted treatment available. And it did the job. She was stabilized. But then she decided to move to a rural area. There was no methadone clinic there. And something you may or may not know about heroin use is that it can make the brain confused, and it can mess up the ability for the brain to appropriately produce dopamine. And I don't know if that's what happened to my person, but she did indeed fall into a severe depression. It wasn't long before she died by suicide. She had no drugs in her system, no illicit drugs, no medication either. I know this because I'm a reporter. I got the coroner's autopsy report. So let's fast forward to 2017 and the Cincinnati Enquirer. I had been working full-time as what we called our heroin reporter for about a year at the direction of Peter Bhatia, who was our editor at the time. And it was just a crazy period. People were dropping all over the place, it felt. In groups, individually, people were overdosing, and fentanyl had set in, and also carfentanil, which we all know now is a large animal opioid. And at the time, when I learned that from a researcher, I dubbed it the elephant opioid, because I said big like a dog, and he said big like an elephant. And one of our editors said, we've got to do something big with heroin this year. So I went to Amy Wilson, our storytelling coach, and I told her about a story idea that Carrie Cochran, who had been a videographer and photographer at the time with us, and Dan Horn, great writer and storyteller and fellow reporter, and I had all had for some time to try to cover this thing 24/7, try to show people what this really looked like around the clock. Amy brought it to Peter. Peter said yes, and everybody was on board. I couldn't have been more stunned nor touched. And that's why the week of July 10th, 65 reporters and photographers headed out onto the streets, under bridges, where people were using heroin, where people were overdosing from fentanyl or heroin, to observing people who were grieving and young children who had been removed from parents who had the disorder and did not have care. We went everywhere, and there was a team of people that tried to count everything that was going on: number of overdoses, number of overdose deaths, number of babies born to moms who either had heroin addiction or previously had one. We wanted to show what this epidemic looked like 24/7. On Wednesday, my photo partner, Liz Dufour, and I went to McMicken Avenue in Cincinnati. And we were pretty sure what we would find. And where we were, we met Allie. Allie was at the time a 25-year-old human trafficking victim who had become addicted to fentanyl. It was hot, it was humid. She was wearing a very little purple dress, and she had her hair all done. And she looked beautiful, but she also looked tragic. She was way too thin, and she was sick from withdrawal. In fact, she told me, I just might throw up on the sidewalk right here. She did not. She kept pulling her hair up like this and dropping it down. And every time she pulled it up, it exposed these big purple bruises on her neck, a darker purple than her dress. And I knew that Allie had been injecting in her neck, probably because her veins had collapsed. And she told Liz and I that she was doing fentanyl about every 2 hours at this point. Suddenly she darted across the street, disappeared for a few seconds. Turns out she had purchased some fentanyl, and she went behind some trash cans and tried to hide while she used it. We saw Allie again months later. She was in a jail recovery pod, which she went to by choice. And she had gained some weight. I almost didn't recognize her. She had color in her cheeks and a little sweet smile. And she hugged Liz and she hugged me, and she said she was better. And after this, upon her release, Allie was going to go home. Her mother hadn't seen her in years. Well, that never happened. Allie went back to the streets, probably back to her dope boy, as she called him, and Allie is in the wind. On Thursday of Heroin Week, as we started to call it, Ann Saker, our health reporter, and Kara Osley, our photo director, went to a clinic that was for babies who had had neonatal abstinence syndrome. And there they met Eliana, who is this beautiful, perfectly healthy, bright little girl, and her mother, Stephanie, who was holding her and kissing her and blowing raspberries on her tummy and smiling and talking about their future together. 14 days later, I believe it was, Anne got a phone call. We sit next to each other in cubicles, but there's a wall between us. But I heard her pick up the phone, I heard her say a few things, and I heard this pause. And then I heard Anne's voice crack, and I just knew it. Anne was being told that Stephanie had died from a heroin overdose just 10 days after Anne and Kara had met her and Eliana. Kara walked over, tears sprung into her eyes immediately, but I didn't cry. I knew something like this was very likely to happen between the time that we gathered and the time that we published. I know and knew then that this kind of addiction, all addiction, is a chronic disorder that needs attention, needs to be treated, and people need help, often for a lifetime. And it's why I carry Narcan, because even though I am a reporter, I observe, I take notes, I investigate, I ask questions. I am not an activist carrying signs or an advocate or anything like that, but I will not let somebody die in front of me needlessly when I know I can restore their breath with Narcan and call 911. So 7 Days of Heroin, as it turned out in 2018, won the Pulitzer Prize for local reporting, and we were stunned. We knew we had informed our community. We hoped people were watching the video and reading the story, but it was just astonishing and exciting to win. And people were throwing hugs around, and maybe some champagne got popped open. But I felt something else too. I felt relief. I felt relief because finally I knew that there were so many people who could see this opioid epidemic the way I had for years, who could see it day in and day out and see its devastation on everybody. 7 Days of Heroin did not solve the epidemic. In fact, this year, 37 states already have reported that they have seen more overdose deaths year to date than any year prior. And it is devastating. But you know what? I have hope. And here's why. Because heroin addiction and most addictions had been like the ugly stepchild of medical care, the dirty secret that people hid. It wasn't addressed by medical people very often. It was more likely to be addressed by criminal justice, if you can call it that. But now, and in 5 or 6 years after I started reporting this, our community is getting better. I know this because I see needle exchanges now, trying to save people from HIV and hepatitis C and trying to get what would have been discarded needles on the street into safe places so these bloodborne infections don't spread. I see jails with recovery pods that do offer the best practices treatment, medication, assisted treatment. I see some people not having to go to jail at all for using fentanyl or heroin. Depending on circumstances, they may be directed into care. I've seen so many outpatient clinics that provide medication-assisted treatment pop up all over the place, including in rural areas. And tens of thousands of people in greater Cincinnati alone apparently are thinking that they won't needlessly or watch somebody needlessly die from heroin. They won't walk past someone who may be overdosing. And the reason I know that is because in greater Cincinnati alone, tens of thousands of people now carry Narcan, just like me. Thank you.